Recording in progress, and we're good to go. Boker Tov, welcome back. Masechet Beitzah, Chet Amud Bet. Chet Amud Bet near the bottom. That's where we got up to. We are concluding the dinim relating to Kisoy Adam and Shchita, and we will conclude today the discussion relating to the first mission on the Masechet, taking us all the way back, all the way back to the beginning. This was the third din, the third machloket that we saw between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel in this Mishnah. Now, the other Mishnayot, we'll get to the next one hopefully today. The other Mishnayot in the first parak are going to go through different machlokot as well between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, many of them related to Yom Tov. Unlike in the first Mishnah, where it is the exceptional cases, whereby Beit Hillel is Machmir and Beit Shammai is Mekel, we're going to go back to normal, so to speak, afterwards. But okay, we are in the middle of, we were discussing the question of whether you can perform shchita on an animal on Yom Tov when you haven't prepared the dirt in order to cover up the blood. We discussed different parameters of that, and the Gemara brought this Mishnah from Chulin that talks about a koi. A koi, as you remember, is an animal which is a safek chaya, safek behema. We're not sure whether it belongs in that category of chaya, whereby there is a mitzvah to cover the blood, or maybe there is not a mitzvah to cover the blood. And then we saw, therefore, that the Gemara made a distinction, gave a few different reasons why there should be a distinction relating to doing the shchita and covering up the blood of the koi versus an animal that you definitely need to. So let's pick it up from the last terutz. The last explanation for that was the following. Let's go. We're about 8 lines from the bottom on Daf Chet Amud Bet, 8 to 10 lines maybe from the bottom. Rami Brei Dravyev Amar Koi Hainu Tama Delom Chasinan Gzera Mishum Matarat Chelbo. We said the reason why you wouldn't cover up the blood of a koi is because of a gzera of Atarat Chelbo, meaning that a chaya needs the kisoy adam to be done to it, but its chaylev is going to be permitted to be eaten. Whereas a be'ema, you don't have to cover up the blood, but you also are not allowed to eat the chaylev. So if you're going to cover up the blood of the koi on Yom Tov, people are going to see it, and people are going to think that the koi is a chaya, and therefore they're going to mistakenly think that you could eat the chaylev. So that is the gzera mishum adarat chelbo. So says the Gemara, if that's the case, afilu b'chol nami. So, okay, if you're worried the reason you can't cover the blood is because people see it, and people think that therefore you can eat the chaylev, what's that got to do with Yom Tov? It's got nothing to do with Yom Tov. You should never be allowed to cover up the blood of the koi, even on Yom Chol. So it says the Gemara, no, b'chol amrin naker chatzerot tzarich. Let's say it on a weekday. Okay, he's just doing it, he's just digging up the earth, he's cleaning up his courtyard. He's not doing it for the mitzvah of covering up the blood. Obviously on Yom Tov that's not the case, because that would be a forbidden tircha, which you cannot do. So then says the Gemara, Sarech shachat b'ashpa ma'ika l'meima, ba'li malech ma'ika l'meima. If you are doing the shchita in a place that you wouldn't tidy up, what can you say? And if ba'li malech ma'ika l'meima, a person comes with a shaila, a person comes along and asks, am I allowed to, should I cover up the blood of the koi? So what are you going to say? You can't say that it's because of cleaning up the floor. If the chacham says, yes, go and cover up the blood, so the person might get confused and they might think they can eat the chaylev. That's the question. So or somebody who's watching, who sees somebody else might come to do that. So says the Gemara now like this. So we said Ma'ika lemema ela b'chol Imasapka Amri Rabanan Zir Tarich Vakasi. But Yom Tov Imasapka Mi Amri Rabanan Zir Tarich Vakasi. In other words, if it's a weekday or this person's come to ask a shayla or whatever, and the person said, and the Rav said to him, go and cover it up. So you'll say on a weekday, okay, there's even if it could be that it's a safek, and therefore they're telling me, go to the chumrah and go and cover up the blood. But if it's Yom Tov, you can't say that it's out of a safek, go and do the tircha of going to cover up the blood, because there's forbidden tircha on Yom Tov. And therefore, it's only on Yom Tov that you would come along and you would therefore say, oh, it must be and that is actually a chaya, and it must be that it's actually it's a chaylev is allowed, and therefore this concern that you might come to allow the chaylev, that's only going to be in the case of Yom Tov, because anytime when it's on Chol, if you see a person covering up the blood, or the Rav tells you to cover up the blood, you'll say, okay, it's a safek, and zil tarach v'chasi, that you can go and you can do the chumrah of covering it up, but that would not apply on Yom Tov. Okay, 5 lines from the bottom. 5 lines from the bottom. Tani Rabbi Zera. Lokoi bilvad amru, el afilu shachat be'ema chaya ve'of, v'nitarvu daman ze b'zeh, asur lachasoto b'yom tov. So says Rabbi Zera, this now is a case, not just regarding a koi, one animal, which is a safek chaya, but even if you have a case, a person went and shechted a number of animals, that's okay, that's permitted. They want to have a big lavish feast on Yom Tov, right? They have lots of guests, so it's not enough. You need the chickens and the cows and whatever it is. So you do the shechita of all these animals together. You have be'ema, chayav ve'of. And again, chayav ve'of, there is a requirement of kisoy adam. Be'ema, there is not. So v'nit alvud aman ze mizeh. They were all did all the shechita in the same place. All the blood now is mixed up. So he says, asur lachasoto b'yom tov. There too, you would not be allowed to do the kisoy adam on Yom Tov because of the blood of the be'ema. Have a look at Rashi. Rashi, 2 lines from the bottom of the page. One of them, even though there is one that certainly requires kisoi, i.e. the case of koi, where we spoke before, we said maybe there we said not to cover because it's a safek, because the blood itself, maybe it needs kisoi adam, maybe it doesn't need kisoi adam. Here, you certainly need kisoi adam for the blood of the chaya or the off, whatever it is. So it's not a safek, but says Rashi, afilu achi en machasin. Nonetheless, we do not cover it up. Why? Mishum tarach nami b'shel beima, because the tircha that you are doing is also for the sake of the beima, for the blood that does not need to be covered up. There is a prohibition of unnecessary tircha on Yom Tov. So if all the blood was covered up, was mixed in together, says Rabbi Zera, you would not cover it up. Says the Gemara, now 4 lines from the bottom, the end of the line. Amar Rabbi Yossi bar Yasineh. לא שנו, אלא שאין יכול לחסותו בדקירה אחת. אבל יכול לחסותו בדקירה אחת, מותר. So says Rabbi Yossi Abiyah, he says no. That which we said it's forbidden, it's only when you can't cover it up in one go, in one shovel, right? If at one point you shovel up the dirt, you only do it once, and that's going to cover up all the blood, so that would be permitted, because you are doing the act. There's no unnecessary tircha. You're doing the act for the sake of the blood which you need to cover. It happens to be covering the other blood as well, but that's fine. However, if right, so that's what he said. You can't do it in one go. Now, this is a theme, by the way. This is a very practical principle of Hilchot Yom Tov. It's going to come up again and again. We'll see it later on in the Masechet. For example, when it comes to cooking. When it comes to cooking, we know that bishul is a melacha of ochel nefesh. It's the melacha of ochel nefesh, which is permitted to do on Yom Tov. Again, nowadays, I don't know how, certainly in Chutz La'aretz, when you have 3 day, what's called the 3 day Yom Tov, often, or even if you have 2 days of Yom Tov, so it's more common maybe for people to do the cooking. Nowadays, we have, with electric ovens and stoves, and there's all sorts of other complications in terms of how we would do it. But if you have time switches, or you have ways of leaving your oven on, or in a way that is safe, obviously. So cooking, the actual act of cooking itself, is permitted on Yom Tov. Now, cooking that is permitted is only for the sake of Yom Tov. What if a person comes along and says, okay, it's Yom Tov, the whole week I'm at work, I'm busy, whatever it is, it's Yom Tov, okay, we're allowed to cook, we're at home, there's no work, we're going to cook, we're going to spend the whole day in the kitchen making all the food for the week. That is completely forbidden. It's completely forbidden, right? Because the allowance, and this is one of the principles of which melachot you can do on Yom Tov and which not, it's the ones you need to do for Yom Tov. You can't, the truth is, even on Chol HaMoed, there are restrictions in terms of what you can do if it's not for the sake of Chol HaMoed, or for the sake of, if a person on Chol HaMoed says, I'm going to use the time to cook now for the rest of the month, not so straightforward that would be permitted either. But what do we say? If a person, does that mean that I now have to work out exactly how much food I'm going to have and how much the guests are going to eat, and not make a single morsel more? Of course not. It doesn't mean that. You can make an amount that you think you need, and if you have leftovers, you're still allowed to eat them after Yom Tov. So the case is, the Gemara makes a distinction like this, as follows. If you are filling up a pot, or let's say you're heating up an urn on Yom Tov itself, or you have one of those kettles that can be filled up while it's plugged in, and it's emptied out. So on Yom Tov itself, you fill it up. You fill it up in order to boil the water. So filling out, you can fill up the whole pot, says the Gemara, even if you only need 1 cup right now. Why? Because when I hold it and I turn on the tap or I pour the water, it's what's called chad tircha. It's one action. I'm not exerting myself anymore in order for that sake. But if a person is cooking, let's say a person's frying schnitzels, right? And I know I need 10 schnitzels for Yom Tov, okay? Or I need 20 or 30, whatever it is, on Yom Tov itself. Okay, if I'm cooking a little bit extra because I think I might need them for Yom Tov, so that's fine. But if I'm now going to say, all right, I'm making 20. If I make 40, I'm going to have for the whole week. So that you aren't allowed to do, because every time you put one in and it's an extra tircha, it's an extra action of going along and doing cooking. That is not for the sake of Yom Tov. That won't be allowed. So the same thing over here. The same thing over here where we say, if there's one action of going along and shoveling up the dirt, and that's going to cover up the blood that you have to cover, so that's fine. But if you're going to do it in more than one action, you're going to shovel a few times. So it could be that the first time all the blood of the chaya was covered up, and now I'm doing it for the sake of the behemah, which is a safek, or it's not a safek, it's not necessary, and that would be a problem. So that is Rabbi Yossi's qualifying statement here to what was said by Rabbi Zera. Now the Gemara says that is obvious. It says pshita. Obviously, if you could do it in one go, you have to cover up the blood of the chaya and the of. So we know you can do that. What's the chiddush? Pshita, says the Gemara, ma'odetema. What would you have thought? You would have thought like this: Nigzol tgila achat, atu shtei tgilot. You would have thought, since it's not allowed in 2 shovels, then we make a gezerah and we say even one you can't, and that would not be allowed. Kamash malan, that no, we don't say such a gezerah. If you can do it in 1 tkira, cover up all the blood of the chaya, that would be, you'd be essentially covering up all the blood, because you don't know which is which, because it's mixed together. That would be permitted. Now, Amar Rabbi, and again, this is another principle which is very practical. Like I said before, these dinim of shchita maybe are not so practically applicable and relevant to us, but the principles that come out of them, of which malacha is allowed on Yom Tov, that is certainly very relevant. So Amar Rabba, now on the bottom line, shachat tzipor me'elev Yom Tov and machasinoto b'Yom Tov. Okay, so here's a different case. What if you did perform the shchita before Yom Tov? Until now, we've been saying about doing the shchita on Yom Tov itself, and then whether you have the dirt or you don't have the dirt, or how many times you have to dig, etc. Yeah, the shchita took place on Erev Yom Tov. So would you be able, but you've not covered the blood, could you now cover the blood on Yom Tov? Says Rabbi, no. You had to. You did it before. You could have done it before, and you should have done it before. Says Rashi in the last Rashi on the Amud, on the staff, and mechasinoto b'Yom Tov. Dahaya lo lichasot mi ba'od moed. You could have you could have covered it up during the day on Erev Yom Tov. Umishum amnue mishum simchat Yom Tov leika. In other words, so what's the havamina? You could have covered up the blood on Erev Yom Tov. Why would I think? Why does Rabbi need to tell me that you can't cover the blood on Yom Tov? That should be obvious. So says Rashi, here's why it's not necessarily obvious. Because you might think Simchat Yom Tov. Now, in the same way that on, according to Beit Hillel, right, on Yom Tov itself, you shouldn't do the shchita when you can't cover up the blood. But if you've done it, you can, that's okay, because we don't want to prevent you from having Simchat Yom Tov. We don't want to prevent you from having your meal. So you might think you can cover up the blood for Simchat Yom Tov. Says Rashi, no, that's not relevant. He said, Mishum no Simchat Yom Tov leika, that would not apply. De Mishum, de lo mechasidam, lo mechsel tzipor v'achila. Since the blood has not been covered, that does not mean that the bird is forbidden for to be eaten. Still have Simchat Yom Tov. You can still have your meal. The bird itself is kosher. Right? Let's think about Tevilat Kelim. Right? Often the question gets asked, somebody who's a guest in somebody else's home, or you go to a place where for whatever reason they have not performed Tfilat Kelim. So the food itself that was cooked in a kli that was not toivel, that food is not treif. The food is still kosher. I'm not talking about hachsharat kelim. If there's a kli that was treifed up, and you have to, that's different. But a kli that was purchased from a non-Jew, so it has to be toiveled in a mikveh. But when a Jew owns it, and if for whatever reason it wasn't, and it was used, you're not allowed to. There's also a misconception people have. People think sometimes that a new kli you have, you're allowed to use it once before you toivel it, or you're allowed to use it temporarily before you toivel it. That's not correct. Halachically, one should toivel the kli before using it. But if it had been happening, you had a pot that hadn't been toiveled, you cooked food in that pot. The food itself is kosher. The food is not treif. Yeah, too. The chicken is kosher, and that animal is okay, or the bird, whatever it is, not necessarily a chicken, but the blood has to be covered up. That is a separate issue, that's separate prohibition. But what we see from here is that anything you could have done before Yom Tov, you're not allowed to do on Yom Tov. That is one of the reasons, that's one of the explanations the Rishonim give as to which those melachot of ochel nefesh were allowed to perform. It's those ones that couldn't have been done before. So then the question gets asked, if you could have done something before Yom Tov, are you allowed to? Let's take cooking, for example. So in the days of the Gemara, especially when you had 2 days or 3 days of Yom Tov in a row, you didn't have refrigeration, etc. There was no choice. The cooking had to be done in Yom Tov. There was no way to cook the food before and have it last by then. In our day and age, where Baruch Hashem, we have fridges, we have freezers, we have all sorts of technological gadgetry, right? You can, and many people don't cook on Yom Tov, right? Many people will cook beforehand, and then you'll just heat up the food. So does that mean that since we are able to perform that melacha and perform that tercha before Yom Tov, that we are now not allowed to cook on Yom Tov? Right? So this is discussed by the poskim. The answer is no. We say there's a difference between, at the end of the day, the poskim say that freshly cooked food is still going to be better. Generally speaking, freshly cooked food is better than food that was cooked a while ago and put in the freezer and heated up. And because there is an increase in quality if it's just been done now, so therefore it's considered that intrinsically, it's not that I could cook it and achieve the same level of taste, etc. And therefore, cooking nowadays is still permitted on Yom Tov itself. Okay. So that is one case. It says Rabbi says Shachat Tzibur me'erev Yom Tov and Machasinoto b'Yom Tov. And now a parallel case. Gilgel Isa me'erev Yom Tov, mafrish mimena chalata b'Yom Tov. So this is a parallel case, but different. Here, he says, again, the similarity is, this is something that you performed on Erev Yom Tov, and the question is, can you finish it off on Yom Tov itself when you could have done before? So the first case was regarding Shchita. Now it's about Gilgul Isa. In other words, a person is kneading a dough. So a person needed a dough on Erev Yom Tov. Again, you can bake, you can put it in the oven, you can do the whole, not getting into now the what needs to be done to allow the use of the oven on Yom Tov, because of electrical things, that's something else. But the act of baking, of cooking on Yom Tov is fine. So if you prepared the dough and you needed it before Yom Tov, but you didn't take challah, you didn't separate challah from it, can you separate the challah from it on Yom Tov? So Rabbi says, yes, you can. Again, some Erev Yom Tov, fresh min chalata b'Yom Tov. Okay, why is this different? Why is this different to the case of the of the shchita and the kisoy adam? So says Rashi, Gilgul. We're now on the top of Taftet Amud Alef. Gilgel is hamer of Yom Tov mafresh mimena chalata beyom Tov. Afal gav titnan lekaman Elohein mishum shvut en magbin trumot u'masrot beyom Tov. So says Rashi. Later on, we're going to see a Mishnah that tells us that min Rabbanan there are certain things we cannot do on Yom Tov. One of them is separating trumot and masrot. We can't separate trumot and masrot from food on Yom Tov itself, certainly not on Shabbat either. That is, there's an element of tikkun. There's an element of some food which was before the trumot and masrot were separated. It was tevel. You couldn't eat it, and now by performing that act of separating trumot and masrot, you make it ready to be eaten, and that is not allowed. That is not allowed. But says Rashi, Anami ketrumat dagan damya. Now, challah is a little bit different to trumot and masrot. Trumot Trumot and Masra, which we have to separate from produce, right? The Truma, which goes to the Kohen, the Maser, which goes to the Levi, and then Maser Sheni or Maser Ani, depending on which year of the cycle you're in. We also have a separate obligation of Chala, which is set aside, and that is given to the Kohanim. That's set aside from the dough. By the way, chala is one of those interesting words that you have in halacha where its real halachic meaning is one thing, but colloquially we use it for something different. When we talk about chala, not in the context of the Gemara, most people are thinking about the loaves that you eat on Friday night or Shabbat morning, right? That we take as our lechem mishnah. That's the chala. But that's not actually what chala means. It's fascinating. Why is it that we chose to use that word to incorporate it? And there's a few other examples of this, by the way. Eruv, for example, I always say, when people talk about an Eruv around the city, you're not really talking about an Eruv. You're talking about a Tzurat HaPetach. The Eruv is something else. Truth is, when we talk about Muktzeh most of the time, we aren't really thinking about Muktzeh. We're normally talking about a Klisha Melachto Le'so, which is a different category. It's not something that's set aside. In any event, but that's one of those interesting idiosyncrasies, I guess, that we have. But that is chala. But now, so says Rashi, that chala is compared to truma. He says, "Anami k'truma tagan damya." And how so? Sheyachol lafrisham erev Yom Tov. So here, in the case where you needed the dough, you could have separated it. The truma you have to separate before Yom Tov. The chala you could have separated before Yom Tov. Nonetheless, he says, "Afilo achi mafrish." Nonetheless, we allow you to separate the chala on Yom Tov itself. Why? Shelo gazru al trumat isa, sharei mutar legalgala b'Yom Tov. He says this whole separation of trumot and maasrot is a shvut. It's a din d'Rabbanan on Yom Tov, and therefore they did not apply it to separating chala, because you are allowed to knead the dough on Yom Tov itself. We said before, a person wants to make fresh bread on Yom Tov, that's permitted. So you take the flour and water and you start kneading the dough, etc. You can do that on Yom Tov, and you cannot trumot and masrot. You have to separate. You can take away from the produce before you start cooking. So that can always be done before. Yeah, if the dough didn't exist before Yom Tov, you can't separate challah from the dough because you don't have the dough. So therefore, this opinion says, since you could knead the dough itself on Yom Tov, and you could be in a situation where challah could not have been separated before, therefore, even if you have kneaded the dough before Yom Tov, you could still separate the challah on Yom Tov. There is no prohibition; it does not exist. That is opinion number one. That is Rabbi. Right? Opinion number two is Avuad Shmuel. Avuad Shmuel. Shmuel's father says, "Afilu gilgel isam erev Yom Tov, ein mafresh mimena chalata b'Yom Tov." Shmuel's father says, no. If you say the word afilu is a little bit stranger, but if you would knead the dough on erev Yom Tov, you cannot separate the challah on Yom Tov. Again, because you could do it before. Says Rashi, Chachamim only allowed us to separate challah from the dough that had been kneaded on Yom Tov itself. This you could have done beforehand, and therefore it's exactly the same as truma of a grain or of fruits, etc. Right? So everybody agrees that because you could knead the dough and you could create the dough on Yom Tov and you could separate the challah from the dough on Yom Tov that you couldn't do before, that would be permitted. The question is, if the dough was kneaded beforehand, is there now a prohibition or does it not apply? That is machloket between Rabbi and Avuad Shmuel. Rabbi says, yes, you can still separate it, the challah, and Avuad Shmuel says, no, you cannot. Now Shmuel, who we'd expect to be more likely that he would hold the same way as his father, says the Gemara, it's actually surprising that Shmuel seems to argue. It says, Leima pliga de Shmuel adavua. Are we then to say that Shmuel disagrees with his father? Why? How so? De'amar Shmuel, chalat chutz al haaretz, ochel volech, ve'achar kach mafrish. So Shmuel says the following, he says, challah of chutz la'aretz, and chutz la'aretz, right, challah is, again, it's a din d'Rabbanan. But he says challah, he says, even the challah of chutz la'aretz, ochel volech, i.e., where one had not separated challah. So when it comes to Trumot and Masrot, for example, you would have to separate it first in order for the food not to have the status of tevel, and then you could eat the rest of the food. But he says when it comes to challah in Chutz La'aretz, says Shmuel, you can eat ve'achar kach mafresh, and afterwards you can separate. You leave a little bit behind and separate that after for challah. In other words, the food itself is not tevel. You can eat from it before the challah has been separated. Says Rashi, ochel v'olech kol apat. You can eat the rest of the bread. You leave enough for challah. And you separate at the end. And therefore, alma that when you separate it, it's not necessary, meaning it's not actually creating that tikkun. That when one separates on Yom Tov, you're not fixing it. We said the reason you can't separate Trumot and Masrot on Yom Tov is because it looks like you are correcting the food, you are fixing the food, you're making it fit for consumption. But if we say that you can consume the food even though the challah has not been taken, so then there should be no prohibition. There should be no prohibition. And Avodah Shmuel was the one who said that you cannot separate challah on Yom Tov, and Shmuel seems to indicate that you could. That is what's the machloket, right? It's not, his words are not directly in contradiction to his father, but it is inferred from the fact that he says that it's not a tikkun. So answers the Gemara, it says actually there's no machloket. It says Amar Rava, mi lo modeh Shmuel she'im kara le'Hashem she'asura lezarim. In other words, Rava says Shmuel would agree, Shem kara le'Hashem, in other words, that you designated it, that you separated it, that you had separated the challah, then she'asura lezarim, the challah can only be eaten by kohanim. It will be forbidden for other people. In other words, what's the Gemara saying? We thought that Shmuel argued because Shmuel said you could still eat this dough even though you have not yet separated the challah, and therefore the challah itself does not create any sort of tikkun, does not create any sort of change. Answers Rava, at the end of the day, Shmuel would agree that although you don't have to designate the challah first, if you did separate the challah, that would be challah, and then it would only the kohanim would be allowed to eat it. So therefore, it is affecting a change, and therefore it's not. We don't necessarily have to say that he's arguing with his father. So bottom line is, we have two different approaches as to what happens if you needed the dough before Yom Tov, but you didn't separate challah, or you forgot to, or whatever reason it was. According to Rabbi, there is no prohibition of separating challah on Yom Tov, and therefore you could do it. According to Avodah Shmuel, and potentially Shmuel as well, there is a prohibition of separating challah on Yom Tov, where you could have done it before. And again, that principle, which remains consistent throughout and applies throughout Ilchot Yom Tov, is that any halacha, even those melachot which are permitted, but if it's done in a way where it could have been done before Yom Tov, then it's going to be problematic in order to do it on Yom Tov itself. Part of the reasoning is that Chazal wanted, and the Torah wanted, a person not to what's called mechaven melachto lamoed, that we shouldn't leave our melacha in order to be done on Yom Tov. We have a rest day. We shouldn't take advantage of it. We should take advantage of it in order to eat and to be with the family and to learn Torah and to be involved in those things for which Yom Tovim were given, but not to do all of one's work. And as I said, that principle applies also on Yom Tov, and it also applies on Chol HaMoed. Chol HaMoed, it's more like a normal day, so it's a lot trickier to figure out exactly when and how to apply it and what can be done and what can't be done, but that's something that we should be aware of. Okay. Ad Kan. So we didn't quite get to the Mishnah, but we will tomorrow, Bezrat Hashem, pick it up from the Mishnah, Daf Tet. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you. Tu bist schwarz zu mir.
Amen.